Okay, let's dive in. We're stepping into some incredibly ancient territory today, places just layered with history.
Traditions shaped over centuries, stories that, well, they still resonate.
Absolutely. So this deep dive is all about taking this stack of sources you've provided and really uncovering the most intriguing insights.
Yeah, the surprising facts, those aha moments.
Exactly. About three key locations,
Mm.
Nazareth, Cana, and Mount Tabor.
And these sites, they aren't just dots on a map, are they? They're really complex tapestries. Faith, history, archaeology, all woven together.
Right. So our mission today is to really dig into the details the sources give us
Help you understand what's most important, what's maybe unexpected.
and how these places connect to these, well, big, enduring stories. Think of us as your guides to the source material, maybe pointing out some hidden gems.
We'll sort through the facts, the traditions, and try to get a clearer picture.
And the sources really highlight how much is going on at each site. It's rarely just one simple story, is it?
No, not at all. Or just one physical spot for that matter.
Okay, so let's start with Nazareth. Now, instead of heading straight to the famous churches, the sources lead us somewhere. Well, a bit more mysterious right off the bat.
Yeah, this large cave or tunnel system near the Greek Orthodox Church of Annunciation.
This is one of those surprising details from the sources, isn't it?
It really is. They describe this space as, surprisingly big, high enough and wide enough for someone to just walk through comfortably.
Wow.
And the real kicker, it's largely unexcavated.
Seriously?
Yeah, the sources are clear. We simply don't know who made it, why it's there, or where it even leads.
It sounds like a bit of an archaeological puzzle box right under the town.
Pretty much. The sources mention it's known by a few names. The Holy Cave, sometimes the Tunnels of Nazareth.
Or just the tunnels under the residence of the head of the Greek Orthodox Church, right?
Exactly. And there's this little detail about a niche inside with a shelf.
Oh, yeah.
And the sources mention it's sometimes claimed to be the world's oldest altar. Now, they're careful to note that's not confirmed.
Okay, right. Good clarification.
But regardless, the sources say this place is just unexpected, leaves a strong impression on people who see it.
I can imagine. And the interpretations. What did the sources suggest it might have been?
Well, a couple of ideas float around. Maybe a hiding place for early Christians escaping the Romans,
Okay, that makes sense.
or potentially a tunnel used by rebels at some point. It's this kind of hidden history, literally beneath the surface of the more famous sites.
Which brings us to those main Annunciation sites. Because the sources really emphasize there are distinct traditions about where exactly the Annunciation happened in Nazareth.
Absolutely. Where Angel Gabriel appeared to Mary, there's not just one spot everyone agrees on.
Right. So the Catholic tradition, which is, grounded in the biblical account, says Gabriel came to Mary in her house.
Mm-hmm. And the modern Catholic Church of Annunciation is built right on that traditional spot.
And what the sources show is just how many layers are under that church. It's kind of incredible.
Totally. They reveal that a Jewish village existed on this very site, like 2,000 years ago. And the current church, the big one, it's built over ruins of a whole series of earlier structures.
Like what?
Well, starting with what they think was a domus ecclesia, an early house church, a gathering place.
Okay.
Then churches from the Byzantine era, the Crusader period, even an 18th century one.
All stacked up. And the core of it is what's identified as Mary's house.
Yeah, exactly. Today, it's often called a cave, but the sources explain it was likely sort of the lower part of an ancient house structure.
Gotcha. Built into the hillside, maybe?
Probably. And inside that space, there's an altar. Tradition identifies that as the place where the incarnation, the Annunciation, actually happened.
Okay. And then the modern church on top.
Built in the 1960s. The sources note the architect, Giovanni Muzio, used a brutalist style. Lots of concrete.
I've seen pictures. It's quite distinct, those holes in the pillars.
Yeah, the sources mention those. Apparently, they were put there for acoustics.
Huh. Interesting detail. And you really see the global reach of Catholicism there too, don't you?
You do. The sources talk about all the icons and artwork inside and in the courtyard. Donations from Catholic communities all over the world.
Now contrast that with the Greek Orthodox tradition.
Right. So this is based on an apocryphal book, one not in the Standard Bible,
Okay.
that the sources reference.
And the sequence of the Annunciation is a bit different.
Yeah, in this tradition, it's said to have happened first at the village spring, Mary was getting water,
Right.
and then Angel Gabriel followed her back to her house for the second part of the announcement.
So the location emphasis is different.
Exactly. And that's why the Greek Orthodox Church of the Annunciation is located right by the water source, the place known as the Spring of Mary.
Makes sense. And the sources give a bit of its history.
They do. Mentioning how the Greek Orthodox community got the church in the 18th century, actually with help from a local Bedouin ruler, Dahar al-Omar.
Oh, interesting connection.
And inside, you see the typical features described in the sources for an Orthodox church, that beautiful iconostasis, the wall of icons, the central royal gate, the standard icon placement, Jesus on the right, Mary with the baby on the left.
And an icon showing the Annunciation itself, usually.
Often, yes. And the sources note the frescoes there were repainted relatively recently in 1975.
It's really striking, isn't it, how two major traditions identify slightly different spots for such a key event, all within the same small town.
It really shows how faith and place get localized, how traditions evolve over time.
Even the name Nazareth itself. The sources suggest a couple of possible origins.
Yeah, maybe from Netzer, which means offspring or branch, linking to David and Jesus' lineage.
Okay.
Or maybe not so, meaning besieged or surrounded by hills, which, describes its geography pretty well.
And the sources even touch on the practical side of things.
Ah, yeah. Noting that when guides take visitors around, the choice of which church to visit might depend on the group's background.
Or sometimes just parking. Where can you actually park a bus near the big Catholic church?
Exactly. It's a reminder that even these deeply sacred places have, well, logistical realities.
Okay, that was a lot to unpack in Nazareth. Let's maybe shift gears and head east a bit to Cana in Galilee.
Cana. Famous, of course, as the site of Jesus' first miracle, according to the sources.
Right, the Gospel of John passage describes him transforming water into wine at a wedding feast there.
And the sources outline basically 3 main reasons tourists and pilgrims go to Cana today.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, the obvious one, to see the traditional site of that first miracle.
Makes sense. Number 2.
This one's really popular, according to the sources. Buying wedding wine.
Ah, yes, the souvenir wine.
Right, and the sources find it kind of noteworthy that Cana today is primarily a Muslim town.
Right.
But the wine sold to tourists is typically from Jewish wineries, often just with a special Cana sticker put on it.
Interesting. It shows the sort of enduring appeal and maybe commercialization of the story.
Definitely. And the third reason people come.
Renewing wedding vows.
Exactly. The sources describe this ceremony, usually held at the Catholic Church, as a really beautiful experience.
Though you need an appointment, right, to get the official certificate.
Yeah, usually. You plan ahead for that.
So the main site for this is the Catholic Wedding Church. You walk to it through a pedestrian zone.
Right, from the parking area. The current building is mostly 19th century, renewed around 1901. But the really fascinating bits, according to the sources, are underground.
Okay, archaeology time. What's down there?
This is where it gets really interesting. The sources mention remains from the Crusader and Byzantine periods. Standard stuff, maybe. But the detail that really jumps out is an Aramaic mosaic inscription.
Oh, tell me about that.
It dates to the 4th or 5th century, and it mentions someone named Bucha and his sons.
Okay, and why is that surprising?
Well, the sources are careful to point out why it's surprising. Inscriptions like that in Aramaic mentioning donors, they're much more common in ancient synagogues.
Not churches.
Not typically, no. Finding that here, in a place identified as a church site, it's definitely unexpected.
So it makes you wonder about the religious landscape back then.
Exactly. Who is here? What kind of community? How did these spaces get used or maybe change hands over time? It raises questions.
Any other early finds?
Yeah. Nearby, the sources also mention finding structures from the 1st to 3rd centuries AD.
Whoa!
Which prompts that thought, could you actually be looking at walls that were standing around the time of Jesus? Walls that might have seen him.
That's a powerful connection to think about. Wow. There was also a unique detail about the statue on top of the Catholic Church.
Oh, right. The sources note that instead of the usual statue of Jesus, it's Mary up there.
Which is unusual for a church's main statue, isn't it?
It is. And the sources explain the reasoning given is that Mary is highlighted here specifically because it was her request, her prompting, that led Jesus to perform this first miracle.
Ah, so she's central to this particular story.
Exactly. So she gets pride of place on the building associated with it.
The sources also briefly mention other churches in Cana.
Yeah, a locked Catholic church of St. Bartholomew and also an Orthodox church, which also claims to be on the site of the wedding miracle.
So two churches, just meters apart, both claiming the same spot.
Pretty much. Just maybe 10 meters apart, the sources say. Another example of how traditions can kind of crystallize in multiple physical locations.
Fascinating. Okay, from the wedding at Cana, let's ascend. Let's go up to Mount Tabor.
Mount Tabor, the traditional location of the Transfiguration.
Right. And the sources describe this event. Jesus being transformed, his face shining, clothes brilliant white.
Yeah, in front of Peter, James, and John, and Moses and Elijah appearing alongside him, this cloud enveloping them.
A very dramatic scene.
Hmm?
Now, the sources point out something important about the location itself, don't they?
They do. While the tradition placing the event on Mount Tabor is very old, it goes back to the 4th century AD.
Pretty early.
Very early. But the name Mount Tabor itself isn't actually mentioned in the biblical accounts of the Transfiguration.
Ah, okay. So the Bible describes the event, but not the specific mountain name.
Exactly. And this distinction is why, as the sources note, some Protestant groups might favor different locations, maybe Mount Hermon or Mount Carnassity.
While Catholic and Orthodox churches follow that very old tradition focused on Tabor.
Correct. They stick with the ancient tradition.
And the significance of the event itself. How do the sources frame that?
Often by comparing it to Mount Sinai, actually. God's appearance there.
Because of the cloud and the voice.
Exactly. On Tabor, you have the cloud and the voice from heaven saying, "This is my son. Listen to him."
And the sources highlight that command. Listen to him.
Yeah, because that part wasn't present at Jesus' baptism in the Jordan River. God identified him as his son then too, but didn't add, "Listen to him."
So Tabor signifies something more.
The interpretation is that here, Jesus is being presented in his full glory and authority, sort of ready for the final sacrifice in Jerusalem.
Right. Okay. And Mount Tabor, like Nazareth, has this incredibly long, complex history of Christian presence.
Oh, absolutely. Detailed in the sources. The very first church mentioned there was built way back in the 4th century AD.
Wow.
And during the Byzantine period, there wasn't just one church, but multiple churches, and a monastery as well.
And they survived for quite a while.
They did. That Christian community even managed to survive the initial Arab invasion in the 7th century. But the sources tell us the churches were eventually ruined.
By who?
By the Ayyubids, Saladin's dynasty, at the end of the 12th century.
Okay, but Christians came back.
They did, later. A monastery was rebuilt, belonging to the Benedictine order, but history repeats itself sometimes.
Ruined again.
Yeah, ruined again by the Mamluk leader Baibars near the end of the 13th century, and that led to the site being basically abandoned for a long time.
There's a really vivid detail from the sources about that period, isn't there?
Yes. From a German pilgrim, Buca, from Mount Zion, he visited at the end of the 13th century, describes seeing the ruins. And seeing a wild beast, he says, a lion there among the ruins.
A lion. Wow. That gives you such a powerful sense of the place just returning to wilderness.
Absolutely. Desolate.
So when did Christian presence really start returning again?
Much later, actually. Not until the mid-17th century, during the Ottoman period.
What changed?
Well, the sources note this was helped by a local ruler named Fekhaluddin II, who was apparently quite sympathetic to Christians and allowed them back.
Okay. And the modern church we see today?
That impressive church in Transfiguration, yeah. That was built by the Franciscan order in the early 20th century.
And the sources name the architect?
They do. Antonio Berluzzi, he was a really important figure, designed many Catholic churches in the Holy Land.
Right. And there's a specific day associated with it.
August 6th. That's the traditional feast of the Transfiguration. The sources mention pilgrims often visit then.
Okay, so looking back at this whole deep dive, wow, we started with that really unexpected, unexcavated tunnel under Nazareth. A real mystery.
Then we explored how those different traditions mark the Annunciation in slightly different spots and all the history layered under those churches.
Then we went to Cana, the story of the first miracle leading to modern traditions, like vow renewals.
And that really surprising archaeological find, the synagogue-like inscription.
Yeah, that was fascinating. And finally, tracing that long, tumultuous history on Mount Tabor. The building, the ruin, the rebuilding.
All tied to the traditional site of the Transfiguration.
The sources gave us the facts, but also these intriguing details and different perspectives.
It really shows how history, faith, archaeology, they're all just deeply, sometimes really unexpectedly intertwined in these places.
It definitely highlights that these sites aren't static, are they? They're not just snapshots in time.
Not at all. They're dynamic. Centuries of building, ruin, rebuilding, evolving traditions, often literally one on top of the other.
Now, like you said, sometimes they offer pretty clear historical connections, but
But other times, they leave us with real mysteries. Like that big tunnel system in Nazareth. What was it for? Where does it go?
or the questions raised by that inscription in Cana, what does it really tell us about that community?
These places, they really hold the weight of history and tradition, don't they? They invite us to look closer, explore the layers.
Whether you visit in person or, through sources like these, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other secrets might still be hidden, maybe just beneath the surface, of places we think we know so well?